Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Matthew 25. I'm your host, Diette Decker, social media strategist for the Presbyterian Mission Agency. And I am thrilled that you joined us today for this very special episode celebrating the life and ministry of Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers, he was an ordained Presbyterian minister who gave us a glimpse into what a Matthew 25 world could look like in his TV show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Embodying the ethos of Matthew 25, Fred Rogers was groundbreaking in his equality, compassion, and charm. And we have a lot planned for today's show. You are definitely going to want to stick around for the premiere of a hymn dedicated to Mr. Rogers, written by our own David Gambrill, titled Jesus, Teach Us to Be Neighbors. But first, we are thrilled to have Stephanie Fritz with us this morning. Mr. Rogers is a big thing, Stephanie, and I know that you and some of your colleagues have worked on some resources to celebrate the second annual Mr. Rogers Day. But first, before we get into all of that, I'm just curious what Mr. Rogers means to you and how he might have influenced your life and ministry.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about Mr. Rogers. For myself personally, I think, as many Gen Xers might say, we grew up with Mr. Rogers. And I lived in a small rural area. There wasn't any preschool per se. And I distinctly remember sitting down and being with Mr. Rogers each and every day before I entered kindergarten. So I think that early childhood connection is very strong with me. Later, became an early childhood educator before I started serving the church. So it's very connected, I think, to Mr. Rogers at a young age.
Yeah, I had the exact same experience. It was, every day sitting down with Mr. Rogers. I loved the shot of the trolley going around the little train track and the dinging. And I mean, it was just a part. I think it became such a part of my life. I almost took it for granted at the time. But now that I'm older, I can reflect back and think, my goodness, what an influence he had. In my upbringing and the way that I see the world. And it's amazing. Speaking of amazing, you created, along with some colleagues, some special resources for Mr. Rogers Day this year. And some of these can be used any time of the year. And one of my favorite was a resource called Neighboring Sunday. And as I understand it, this is sort of a guide to planning an experience of worship. Can you tell us a little bit more about this resource and how these resources came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, we're in our second year of honoring Mr. Rogers on Mr. Rogers Special Emphasis Day. This year we partnered with the Office of Peacemaking and Theology and Worship to create these resources. But our Neighboring Sunday resource we came out with last year, and we have some enhancements to it this year. This was born a few years back, actually, when I was serving a church in Denver, Colorado, a downtown church. And that particular congregation really had a commitment to knowing its neighbors, long history of knowing its neighbors. And every summer we would engage in a summer of service. So we were looking for a way in which to really get out in the neighborhood in a worship experience. And so that's where Neighboring Sunday was born. Many downtown churches still have a lot of commuters, people that are passionate about urban ministry and choose to commute to a downtown church and may not understand the neighborhood in which they go to church in. But we wanted to expand this. We happened to come out with this resource right in the middle of COVID, right? So we wanted to make sure that there were many different options and ways to use it. So you might gather with your congregation on a Sunday morning and engage in this experience. It might be something that you gathered together over Zoom and blessed one another and went out into your own neighborhoods, right? How powerful to really get into your own neighborhood, come back together and share really how you can do ministry in your own neighborhood. And there's a variety of other ways in which you can engage in it. This year we added the liturgy pieces, and you've talked about the hymn, Walking in God's Path of Peace, Intergenerational Worship. So these two pieces can be used together. You can do the interactive, experiential, neighboring Sunday piece using some of the liturgy, or you can use the liturgy, encourage folks to go home and engage in their neighborhoods. So we're excited about it because it offers a number of different ways for folks to really engage.
That was the thing that I loved about it. There's such an intergenerational piece to these resources. So it's not just for kids, it's not just for adults, it's bringing the whole of the neighborhood together. One of the things that I loved as a kid watching about Mr. Rogers was that I could see grandparents, I could see kids my age. It was everybody. And I think that's the thing that stuck with me about Mr. Rogers and the Mr. Rogers neighborhood. And I love that these resources are meant to sort of bring the neighborhood together to actually learn about our neighbors and our neighborhood. So what are the things that you see, or let me put it this way, what are your hopes for churches and for their neighborhoods as they use these resources and reflect on Mr. Rogers and his neighborhood?
Yeah, well, I think as we explore being a Matthew 25 church, as we live into that invitation and call, we have to know our neighborhoods, right? So my hope is that we really listen. Mr. Rogers really had a value of storytelling and listening. He really modeled that. So we need to get out into our neighborhoods and really listen. If that's the only thing that we do, that's a wonderful first step, right? With this first piece. If that's your first entrance into your neighborhood, is to listen to your neighbors, you've made an important step.
And didn't Mr. Rogers say that, is that we listen more with we see more than just with our eyes and listen more than just with our ears, talking about how we need to bring our heart into our listening. So sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. And another quote that we often use is, there's nobody that you can't learn to love if you know their story. So that's my hope for churches, is that they use resources not as a step-by-step guide, but it's contextual in their area. They know their neighborhoods best, and they use these as tools to enter into, meaningful relationships, meaningful partnerships, and really understanding the neighborhoods in which they serve and live in.
I'm curious about the idea of neighborhood. You had mentioned COVID and that some of these resources came out during COVID. And I know for me and my family during COVID, one of the things that we did often was walk in our neighborhood. But we were still very isolated. It was just sort of a wave from the street and that type of thing. What do you think where we're going in terms of interacting with one another in this, I'm not going to say post-COVID, but in these times, and how can these resources help folks to begin to bridge the gap that COVID times sort of created for us?
Yeah, sort of the return of the front porch, right? Or the front driveway. There were lots of driveway parties, porch packages being dropped off by churches, sort of waving through the windows. And I think one of the things for COVID is folks got to know their neighborhoods again. They were not rushing off to 1,000 different things, and they learned about their neighborhoods. And I think we can use that. We can remember what that felt like and how we might want to be more in touch with our neighborhoods. The resources themselves, there's lots of fun things to use. The 15 ways to engage, the worship service, the hymn, the, engaging in Sunday. We also have, from peacemaking, the great peace cards that are a really good way to really enter into conversation. we have to practice those conversations together so that we can go out and do that in the neighborhood. And I think that's what our churches are for. We practice, we engage, and we go out. We practice, we're together, we engage, we go out. So I think the peace cards is a great way to really talk about peace and reconciliation, something that Mr. Rogers was absolutely all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So who all were, I mean, so it seems like this was a beautiful collaboration between lots of different ministries within the
Yeah.
PMA.
Yeah. So the peacemaking office in our compassion, peace, and justice area is a long-standing relationship with Mr. Rogers and materials that they've produced. So we definitely brought them in to this project, knowing that they had a lot that they could offer. So we worked together with peacemaking, theology, and worship, and of course, David Gambrell worked to do the worship service and the beautiful hymn, and contracted with a musician to write the great jazzy melody that people are talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think it's, we have to remember Mr. Rogers loved jazz too, right? So it kind of brought in that fun. Yeah, yeah. So those small team of those folks came together to put these together. It's a great partnership.
Beautiful partnership, and the resources are amazing. So I have been told that Diane is here and wants to talk about Mr. Rogers. There you are. Hey, friend.
Yes, sorry about that. I will. This has been a really busy
you're hopping
day.
from one thing.
Oh gosh,
you're just hopping from one thing to the next.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
I'm curious, Diane, about what you think of the of just how Mr. Rogers embodied the Matthew 25 ethos.
Well, again, the idea of neighbor, who's my neighbor? He was always talking about how important it was to, in essence, respect and to care for one's neighbors. That's what I remember. I mean, who did not grow up seeing Mr. Rogers? Come on, right? And so it was always about, that was the key word, neighborhood. And I think for Mr. Rogers, he was always concerned about those who were quote unquote different, and he would introduce that into our thoughts, and the importance of treating everyone. It wasn't until later that I understood he was a Presbyterian and that he was a teaching elder, that he was a pastor and so forth. So I learned that later, but I can definitely see how he was helping younger people and children to just really understand what faithfulness requires in terms of discipleship, loving God, loving our neighbor as ourselves, and being sensitive to our neighbor. Yeah. So that's definitely a Matthew 25 piece. It's a disciple piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just thought of, the idea of neighbor, and something that came to my mind was the thought that a lot of times, the love our neighbor as ourselves. And a lot of times I almost feel like we're looking for who isn't our neighbor more than we're looking for who is our neighbor. We're more apt, maybe just in today's day and age, to say, oh, well, you're different. You don't necessarily live in my neighborhood. You're, kind of the other. Where Mr. Rogers so much said, no, we're all neighbors. We are all beloved. And that is one of the things that I absolutely love about Mr. Rogers.
The other thing I understand, I went to the church where he did a lot of his work. And I think when I understand this to be true, that he really took Matthew 25 seriously, to the point that one of the church members, that when I was on presenting Matthew 25 to, I think it was Liberty Presbyterian Church, they said that he really struggled. I hope and pray that I've lived a life that, Jesus makes a distinction, particularly verses 31 to 46, between those on the right and the left, the sheep on the right, the goats. And his whole thing is, I certainly hope that I've been a sheep, that what I'm trying to get at is a sense of humility, but also an understanding that was a major scripture for him, that even as he was preparing, to leave this earth on this side, he was contemplating Matthew 25. I thought that was amazing. And I don't even remember who shared it with me, but it stuck with me as, wow. So he definitely was thinking about how we are all human neighbors. We're neighbors one to another.
We've got a question from a viewer. They say, Mr. Rogers said his mother told him to look for the helpers. And to me, Matthew 25 is directing us to helpers. Do you or Stephanie see it this way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Stephanie may want to. But I mean, my whole piece in with Matthew 25 and is that if we were to hang our hat on any one of the foci, and so for our audience, you probably know it's building congregational vitality, which has to do with faith formation, making disciples, nurturing disciples, and growing in the faith. So we have a clear understanding of what faithfulness requires. It is disciples we are calling out of our faith and our love for Jesus Christ, following him, that we do everything else. So we look for the disciples who will do the work. We look for the disciples who will say yes to the call to help reconcile the world, to make sure that racial justice and oppression is no longer, a factor, that we're building a new kingdom, as Jesus would have said, that poverty, we have plenty for everybody. No one should go without the basic necessities of life. So how is it that we eradicate poverty? We're looking for people that are doing that. And I am so excited that we have so many Presbyterians that are doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like
Stephanie,
that.
What about you?
Yeah, I would say I like that framing of that, Diane, that the helpers are those that feel called to be leaders in this work. For Mr. Rogers, looking to the helpers in a traumatic event really had to do with children, right? He was he's a children's educator, and he looked to the needs of children. I think pointed us on how we need to let the little children come to him first, right? So for Mr. Rogers, it was about bringing up that from traumatic events and things that are scary, and it's okay to be scared. And we're looking for those helpers to show us to lead the way. So I think those are both really nice framings of that context, because I think, as Diane would know too, we don't want to get to a place where we're thinking, oh, well, we're coming to be the savior of the neighborhood and we're going to help those people. Right. No, we're looking for the helpers that are called to this work. So, yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah, I love that. Love that. Yeah. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your insights and talking with us about the resources that are available. And again, I love that they can be used anytime throughout the year. Mr. Rogers should be celebrated year round in my view. I even got my cardigan on to celebrate Mr. Rogers, and I see, Stephanie, you do as well.
Yeah,
so
kind of. Here it drops.
But thank you so much for sharing.
It'll be invisible. Okay. Mr. Rogers had a great imagination. So just imagine me in a red sweater.
That's right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Stephanie, thank you again.
Just kind of let everybody know that if they're celebrating Mr. Rogers Day, to make sure to use that hashtag Mr. Rogers Day and share pictures. We got great pictures and stories last year, and we want to hear those this year too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That would be great. And maybe we can put some of those out on social media for folks to see and share how other people are celebrating with their families of faith. So thanks again for sharing your time with us again today. It's always such a pleasure to spend time with you.
Thank you very much.
With recent events in Ukraine, we have been reminded that our neighbor is more than the person next door or the friend down the street. We also live in a global neighborhood. And joining us now is the Reverend Scott Parker, World Mission Associate for Trauma Resiliency Facilitation in the Middle East. And today, Scott discusses the global neighborhood and shares a bit about Strong Kids, a ministry to support children who have experienced trauma. So, Scott?
Do not adjust your set. I am a trained professional sock puppet here to give you my impression of a duck. This is a duck. Look out! That was a duck. It may take a moment for some of you to get that. I will wait. Okay. That's enough puppet-based humor. Hi, my name is Scott Parker. I am a World Mission Associate for Trauma Resiliency Facilitation in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, living in Beirut going on 9 years now. Over 5 years ago, the Middle East Council of Churches, MECC, asked me to address the immense needs around child trauma, which led to the development of Strong Kids, Strong Emotions, which is a 12-week play-based trauma resiliency program for Iraqi and Syrian refugee kids. Fred Rogers has said that play is the work of childhood, hence the puppets and the craft supplies. One of my favorite things to do is dump a suitcase of pipe cleaners and googly eyes onto the table and invite our kids to make whatever their imagination compels them to create. And this practice is actually based in neuroscience and evidence-based research. There is scientific evidence to suggest a connection between a person's capacity for anxiety and their capacity for creativity, as if the two rest on the same toggle switch and are unable to simultaneously function. So when I am consumed by anxiety, it is very difficult to think creatively or even to talk creatively. But when our kids engage in a creative activity, the anxiety shuts off, and that creates a safe place for our strong kids to talk about difficult things, to be in relationship, to heal, and to simply be a kid. For refugee families in the Middle East, there's not a lot of space to be a kid. I could spend hours talking about the difficult conditions that refugee families live under and the realities of generational trauma that gets passed on from parents to their kids. But I want to focus on why addressing child trauma is so essential. There is a study called ACEs. This is a landmark study conducted by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente in the mid-1990s. And the ACEs study focused on how traumatic childhood events may negatively affect adult health. And they found a direct link between childhood trauma and adult onset of chronic disease, failure in school, incarceration, divorce, and unemployment. The higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, the greater the impact of obstacles that hinder that person's ability to thrive in adulthood. So, if we want to get serious about eradicating systemic poverty, we've got to get more serious about addressing child trauma. And that's why Strong Kids, Strong Emotions exists. The Strong Kids program uses the trauma resiliency model, also known as the community resiliency model, which we just call TRM, CRM, or TRIM and CRIM for short. This was authored by the activist, social worker, and nurse Elaine Miller-Karas. And TRIM and CRIM is a biology-based model that teaches people to understand how their body processes trauma. Trauma is biology, not weakness. And as they learn this, they learn how to track their body's sensations of distress and wellness. So they become aware when a traumatic memory or event activates them and bumps them into their high zone, where they're upset, angry, or afraid, or it bumps them into their low zone, where they are experiencing deep sadness or depression or numbness. Then the person is able to use a whole variety of somatic sense-based skills to bring them out of the high zone or the low zone and back into what we call the resilient zone or the okay zone. This is an empowerment model that allows kids and adults to manage their own symptoms of trauma by using biology-based skills to reset their own nervous system. I've been working with trauma in hospitals and communities for over 11 years. I've been trained in multiple models, and TRIM and CRIM is hands down the best model in terms of equity. It's based in biology, not culture. So any faith group or people group can apply these skills to their culture, their faith, and their sense of meaning. TRIM and CRIM is a practical, deceptively simple model that can be taught to community members who can then teach it to the people in their own circles of influence. TRIM-CRIM is an example of what's called appropriate technology. And this is a term that means technology that ordinary people can use for their own benefit and the benefit of their communities that doesn't make them dependent on systems over which they have no control. So this is equity-based. Rana Abu Rashed is the Arabic child psychologist with whom I partner to facilitate Strong Kids. And both of us have been trained in TRIM and CRIM. And our work is to develop reproducible, resiliency-informed communities who can embody and teach resiliency skills in regions that are experiencing trauma. And finally, I can't talk about Strong Kids without mentioning involvement with our U.S. partner congregations. There's a lot of different things that my spouse and I do in the Middle East, but Strong Kids has uniquely captured the imagination of so many of our U.S. partner churches, and they are intimately involved in a whole variety of ways beyond simply funding us. Now, one could be cynical and say that we're just playing the cute kid card to touch a congregation's soft spot. I'm okay with that because so much of the trauma I work with has come at the hands of US militarism, US economic warfare, our immigration policy, our racism. And congregations, by and large, have been unaware and unengaged because the people of these countries are held at arm's length. Strong Kids helps to erase that gap, and it creates relationship, which leads to action and change. And we are working to make that relationship mutual. This month alone, Strong Kids is working with 2 different PCUSA congregations to lead virtual resiliency skills seminars for the people in their US communities that are under-resourced and dealing with trauma. US communities learning resiliency from the experience of refugee families. The Middle East Council of Churches is using Strong Kids, Strong Emotions, not only to bring life-changing resiliency skills to underserved communities, but we are also working to make our global neighborhood a little closer and a lot healthier.
Wow, I certainly enjoyed learning about Strong Kids. Thanks so much to Scott Parker for that. Hello, everyone. I am Diane Moffatt, Executive Director and President of the Presbyterian Mission Agency. And I love to hear stories of Matthew 25 churches or presbyteries in action, learning how they are engaging their neighborhood and world. And so today we're highlighting the Seattle Presbytery and the work they are doing to understand their neighbors and neighborhoods and learning with and from each other as they learn from each other. So anyway, I want you to listen now to this video. Don't leave. It is going to be inspiring for you.
I know it sounds very simple to ask, what is this? So take a look around, ask yourself, what do you see? Just be observant, like a scientist would be, trying to pull apart all the things you observe. You don't have to have answers for anything. You just what is this?
We had been working with Tally on some congregational revitalization plans, and what we were noticing was the many of our congregations were dealing with the same issues, very homogeneous, aging congregations, and didn't really have a process to get at, to rethink who they were and to rethink their community and to rethink how they can really kind of re-engage ministry together in a different way.
Scott and Eliana said, go talk to those churches. And we began a conversation together that has led us to develop this approach and to really dive deep into what does it mean to creatively cultivate Christian practices that are informed by our social and cultural context of the communities that we are in. And when we say communities there, we are learning a lot about what that means.
Then what narrative is attached to this? What stories do we tell ourselves about this place or these places? Right? So the first thing we look at is the relationship between place and story. What do you think the story is that has allowed this very probably expensive piece of property to be held as a old city park, I guess? I mean,
I think it says something different to a person who looks like me, who lives in the area, than the person who looks like you who lives in the area. So it's this sort of nostalgia for the old times, for the way it was. And
yes!
I mean, I think about people who don't have yards, you know, so a green space is a great thing. But can those people even live around here anymore? You know, I mean, it's like...
Yes!
While we're doing this work and trying to figure out what is that our churches need, our denomination is also going through something similar and is identifying through the Matthew 25 initiative these 3 areas that are of paramount importance to our identity as a denomination and as a church. And they have to deal with anti-racism, has to deal with poverty, and being a vital congregation. And so for our presbytery that had already identified those 3 as values, it was really a very simple leap to just say, well, of course we're a Matthew 25 presbytery, we hold those values as well. So the Matthew 25 initiative has provided us with the confirmation that we are on the right track in the values that we have highlighted for ourselves as the presbytery looking into the future.
One of the things that caught our attention was this question that Tim Shapiro, in the book that Lily set out to us to kind of think through, if you will, was how your congregation learns. A question that we have really built some of this around, a lot of this around. And this is an interesting quote, that congregations just don't do new things, they learn to do new things. And so we looked at this as, what does it mean for us to be a learning community?
There is a nostalgia. The homesteader European way of life, this instantiates in this community, even though it's 100 to 150 years old, not 1,000 years old. But it's an attempt to root a cultural narrative about who this place belongs to.
The Thriving Congregations process program has allowed us to integrate that work together.
Which then led us to this opportunity, which, these things unfolded in a certain way in God's timing. When the presbytery was afforded the Lilly Grant to begin the Thriving Congregations Learning Cohort, all of a sudden we had this real tangible way of creating learning cohorts among our congregations to delve into these values, these things that we had previously said were important to us, that had been confirmed to us by a denominational initiative. Now, here we were given funding, and we have at the helm of this program Tally Hairston, who's been working with us all along, who is able to codify and to create a structure and a process for our congregations to engage in these conversations, where churches are getting an opportunity to look inwardly in order to examine how are we impacting our community outwardly.
People always go, well, what's that relationship between Redmond Presbyterian and this? I want you to think about something called social worlds, okay? And if you take that narrative, it doesn't connect to a sermon on Sunday necessarily. It doesn't connect to a homelessness maybe, but the narrative does say a lot about who belongs and who doesn't. This is just a symbol of a larger narrative that speaks to our social world. So when you look like you come from Pakistan or India, narratives of log cabins don't speak to your settlers, don't speak to your story. So the question would be, for me, the next question to your point about a different story for me or people of color would be this: where is our story told?
The congregations that we have in the Presbytery who are participating in this learning cohort and thriving congregations is that they're actually engaging in that hard thing, which is having the hard conversation.
Yeah.
That is so easy to shy away from as a church because you're so busy taking care of the programmatic and all the other to-do list items and avoiding the deeper, harder conversation about who are we and who are we in reference to where we are and who God is calling us to be.
So this is inherent in our faith. I'm not asking you to change the faith. Not at all. And when you sit in this space, this is what it should leave you with, right? These questions about what this has to do with Redmond Presbyterian, or what this has to do with Mercer Island Presbyterian, or what this has to do with Newport Presbyterian. Because all of those communities have this. The ways they're rooting the narrative of the settler, of the homesteader, and not rooting the narrative of the refugee and the immigrant, the foreigner, the stranger. Okay, what are you thinking now?
Wow. So how are we engaging in our neighborhoods? How are we hearing those stories and including all? Those are two very powerful ways. What I'm excited to introduce to you now is the hymn, Jesus Teach Us to Be Neighbors. The words by Reverend David Gambrell and the tune from composer Will Smith were added this year. All churches have permission to use this hymn, to download the music and to reproduce and use in your congregations. And I think that we're able to listen to that now.
Hands for helping one another. children of the new creation, singing praise in harmony.
Wow, what a beautiful hymn celebrating being neighbors. That's so central, being neighbors to one another as we celebrate the life of Mr. Rogers. Listen, the Matthew 25 vision is our guidepost. And of course, being neighbors one with one another, treating one another with respect is so central to Matthew 25. As we look at this vision, we know that action is our charge. And together we are evolving as a denomination, as a people of God, putting our feet to faith, our legs to love, and our hands to hope as we focus on actively engaging our world. So I hope you are as excited about being a Matthew 25 church as I am. I hope you are ready to work with others and to help heal God's people as we look at systems and structures that oppress and discriminate against other people. If you are still discerning the invitation to be a Matthew 25 church, please visit the website listed for resources to help you in the process. And of course, you can reach out to me or anyone in our office. We are here to serve you. I want to thank those who have already made the Matthew 25 commitment and have joined so many others, thousands of Presbyterians in this journey. And I think I'm supposed to close us as well. So I hope that is the case. So as we end this time together, I want to say thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for helping to connect and unite all Presbyterians in our common witness. Thank you for your questions and your conversations. And if you have any additional questions, or if you are in need of resources, please email us at the address below. We want to hear from you. We are in service to you. I hope you will join us for our next episode on Being Matthew 25. It is Thursday, April 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we will be discussing the idea of generational change as conversations for seasons to come. Until then, remember, we are the church together. We are being a Matthew 25 denomination.